we'll spend a little bit of time the next hour or so to talk about the case study method. I understand that some of you might be using it in your teaching, some of you might be exposed to it, some of you might also actually operate by the case study method in the way that you run your teams and your companies by soliciting different ideas from the individuals. I'm going to take a little bit of a trip back in time just to sort of situate where the case method came from, what was its intent at the time, a little bit of the current challenges and changes that we've seen. And then at the end, because we're in the middle of the ChatGPT hysteria, spending a little bit of time around, how I might think about using it to write cases, how faculty members might be thinking about using it to be, teaching assistants or giving some ideas. And then on the theme of humanization, business schools, like a lot of institutions around the world, have been confronted with the fact that there's a lot more that they could be done around social issues and topics of material and environmental importance. And the question is, how do you use the case method to talk about these issues, and how do you present case protagonists that may have different backgrounds? Danisa told you a little bit about my background. I am a case writer. I am an interviewer. I derive a lot of energy from learning from people. So I would be very grateful if you ask me questions, interrupt anytime, please lift your hands. I know that on Zoom, we have somebody who's watching the chat. So I want this to be as helpful to you as possible. I can talk about cases all day, for many days. That's probably not what you want. And I would also learn from you in some ways. We've been at this 100 years at the business school, which is good because we've been at this 100 years. And in another way, it's also bad because we're very set in our ways. And so a question for us is, how do we actually adapt with the times? A few years ago, I had the pleasure of working with our current dean, Shrikant Dakar, on a book called Rethinking the MBA. And as part of the research, we went to see and interview and write cases on many different business schools. And when I got to INSEAD, the faculty member says, well, who are you? And I said, oh, I'm just a case writer. And he said, just a case writer? He said, you are Caesar's scribes. The way that you write about business is going to shape the way that people think about business. And so often in training or whenever I'm writing, I sort of think about the fact that how we write about people matters deeply. You know that as academics and empirical researchers also. So this is a little bit our path today. Please speak. Please let me know if there's something that I say that you do not agree with. If there's something of a case method that you do not like, I am attached to the method, which means that I want to make it better. There are limitations to the method, so please share any concerns that you might have. The business school is now very established, but it actually started as a delicate experiment. So there were people across the river who said, we want to study business. The true academics said business is a vocation. It's actually not an academic experience. So they gave them a piece of land, basically on a swamp on the Charles River in Boston. And they say, here, the 5 of you can figure out how to teach business. So from this very modest background, a little bit like many business schools who get started, the school has sort of emerged into what it is. There were 15 faculty at the time. It sort of came up with a very new degree at the time, which 100 years later is still there. And we had a double mission, which was to have a curriculum that would educate business leaders and to make clear and significant contribution to business theory and practice. So the notion of influencing practice was very central to the foundation of Harvard Business School. And we'll talk in a little bit about the fact that the case method is actually very connected to our intent on staying close to practice. Our mission today is educating leaders who make a difference in the world. This is a copy of the very first case. So it's only a page long. And what's interesting about this case is that it presents a labor issue. And if you were to read it, and you can read it, it's available online. The source is actually to an exhibit that, if you're interested in some of this history, you might appreciate. And basically, it's people working in a shoe factory, and they're unhappy with management. So they start to leave early, tinker around with things. So the same dynamics that we're seeing between labor and employees and the workplace that we'll talk about tomorrow, you already see. The case is very brief, it's very relevant, you can expand it to a bunch of industries. So very much it's a template for what we've been trying to do. The real reason to write cases, though, is to teach by the case method. One of the real pioneers of case teaching was Wallace Dunham. I'm going to share all the slides after, and there's also a version of the slides where there's a little bit more text for those of you who might be interested in something else. But so the idea is, not telling people how to do business, but think about how they might actually do business. So from the very outset, this was our goal. The notion of participant-centered learning that takes the faculty off the stage and really makes them, sort of integrate people. You're not lecturing at, you're facilitating learning, which you're exposed to. So the technology spread really rapidly, actually. It did speak to something. It did speak to a need. It was very controversial at the time, which we tend to forget. And 2/3 of our cases still use, 2/3 of our courses still use the case method today. And this is how I got my cases. Now, we still distribute some cases like that. Some of it's still on PDF. So some quick facts about what it looks like today: 16,000 cases. Some cases get taken out after a while when they're not being used or they're being replaced. The top 5 are interesting. I mean, they're very US centered. You'll note that this is a relatively new case, but one of the challenges that we have is that once people start using cases and figuring out how to use it, a little bit like you have a tool and it works, it's difficult to adopt new cases. So that's an enduring challenge. And believe it or not, we actually still use a case from 1942, which is on Dashman Company. Since in the past few years, the school has been very active at doing podcasting. So I don't know if you've ever listened to Cold Call, but it's a place where the case author is being interviewed and they're asking, why did you choose this case? Why did you do it? What is it about? And we're now on the 200 session. Any questions or reactions to this? No. Maybe a show of hands of how many of you are case writers? How many of you are case users? Yeah. Okay. Yes. So how many of you use cases in your teaching? Okay. And so could I have a little bit of input from the audience about what might be of interest to you? So in terms of, if you're business leaders, do you use them in your training or anything like that? Or okay, so I'll speak in general, and if there are any questions, please let me know. So there are several reasons why cases matter. Often we think of them as products to be sold, so the school makes a lot of money selling them. But one of the main functions of the cases is that it forces us to go interview. And so faculty will have a research theory, they go into an area, and then they will meet somebody and say, so this is my research about how mergers occur. So how did this merger go for you? And you might tell me something that is completely different from what I think the theory is. If everything goes well and I'm paying attention, I will come back and think of a research question that is based on a case that I've actually seen in practice. So one of the important things that the case method does for faculty is that it gets them talking to the practitioners that they then wind up teaching in the classroom. The people that they teach in the classroom often become protagonists of cases because they will call us up and say, I've got a business situation, I think it will be interesting. So there's a real virtual circle that occurs when the method works well, it informs new idea. For students, the point of a case is basically to put you in a position of decision-making. So when I'm put in a position of decision-making, 2 things occur. First, I have to interact with the decision that I'm making. And second, I have to figure out why am I making the decisions? Why am I approaching the decisions in this way that I am approaching them? So after doing 800 of these cases in the MBA program, you say, oh, my tendency is to be extremely expedient or to overcomplicate things. So you're learning from the content of the cases and the lessons they teach. You're also learning from your own reaction. And many business schools use study groups so that you prepare on your own. You have study groups where we may come together and realize that we have very different perspectives. Then we will have the classroom, learn again that different perspectives matter. And then at the end, faculty often ask, to do your own takeaway. I think in some ways, we've spoken a lot about the polarization of society. If you think of the case method as the ultimate sort of place where people can still actively disagree on the same set of facts, It's extremely rare in our society. So to me, the case method is a modern technology, because if we can hone some of the skills that we have develop in the classroom when they're honest conversations, maybe we can use them in society. So in some ways, the case method might feel antiquated to some. I actually think it's an extremely, it has the potential to be extremely helpful in modern times. So people often ask, what are the hallmarks of a good case? When I get asked, because I'm a case writer supporting faculty, my answer is a finished case. That's my notion of a good case. But it is a case that is going to reach all of these objectives. In order to reach all of these objectives, the faculty member has to be clear about how things will evolve in the classroom. And that is the teaching note. So good cases are paired with a teaching note. A teaching note is an instruction manual about how you would use the case. Because if you read a case about a story without knowing what questions to ask, it's going to be very difficult to make it sing in the classroom. So often people develop teaching notes and instruction manuals. In the teaching note, classically, you will have, if a student mentioned this, do this. If nobody speaks, do that. So it helps the faculty adopt the method. Teaching by the case method is very frightening because you do not know really what comes up. So when I was in class, we had a case on South Africa that the faculty had taught for 5 years straight. And he didn't realize that we had actually somebody who had been jailed. And so he raised his hand, and the faculty member was completely derailed because it wasn't in the teaching plan. So there's a lot of anxiety for faculty members to use the method, and it makes it a costly method to use. So the better your teaching note, the better the approaches are to what you can do if things don't quite go your way in the class is helpful. So that's the theory, that's the beauty, this is what could happen. Unfortunately, we live in the real world. And in the real world, we have people who are, our attention spans is really declining. It's very painful. The classes are 80 minutes long. We tend to teach devices down, so no access to your devices. And people ask, how can a method that is forcing people to pay attention to each other for 80 minutes survive in this? It's a very valid question. I think much like managers, we have a lot of bored employees. You have a lot of bored students. You got to figure out how to engage them. You got to figure out why they're bored in the first place. And then something that is actually a great threat to the case method itself is what we call in the US the cancel culture, which is if you have a case that may be dealing with an issue that is a little bit more touchy, or even let's say an issue around egg freezing, it's going to be very difficult for a student who is religious to express their concerns, because immediately they will be branded as conservative, they will be branded as right-wing, they will be branding as haters of women. So these conversations are not coming up. And much as they don't come up in a lot of, sort of business context, it's very difficult for people to disagree productively. The other dynamic that we have in the classroom is that there's a gender balance. And so you don't want to come off as being too aggressive. You don't want to come off as being too pushy. And so there's a lot of censoring of students. And so much like good managers, good case method teachers say, the only way this works is if you engage with the ideas of the other. The only way to engage with the ideas of the other is that if the ideas of the others are slightly different from you. So how do you think about teaching in an environment like this one? We have more diversity in case authors, which means that we're writing cases about different people who may be from a very different social environment from ours. It builds empathy for the students, but sometimes they're not quite sure about how to handle it. Some of these cases, so we're supporting a case on rent control, which has been a big topic in the US and in Boston. And how do you present the issue to make sure that people will be willing to discuss? The case method is based on disagreements. So we are using the case method to discuss topics that maybe we think is no debate. So let's talk climate change. You're going to teach a case. It's going to be very difficult for somebody, or completely wrong for somebody in the class to say, it is not a problem, let's go on. So we have to be careful about to what extent you can use the case method to address these issues, and then we'll talk about how we actually present individuals. So I think, you know, our challenge around the case method are pretty much the challenges of society, challenges of most teachers. And then the question is, to what extent do you lean in? So do you write shorter cases? Do you write funner cases? Do you gamify the cases? Do you write cartoon cases? We'll talk about some of these ideas after. So since you are not, you know, there isn't much writing, and this will be in the slides, I'll just go over it, and then we can go to you know, the rest. But there's a checklist of things that a case has to do. So as a case writer, you know, it has to have a focus. It has to sort of have a specific point and a specific issue. It has to be complete enough to have information that you can deal with. It has to be clear and succinct. One thing that has happened, I think, with decreasing attention span is that we are finding it increasingly difficult to have people who write clearly and concisely. There's much more cut and pasting. We see this in academia also. We used to really have to think before we typed. I actually started typing my cases. Now you're like, oh, I'll do something and then I'll edit it, and then somebody else will edit it. So you wind up with these mishmash of voices. And it's also a story. It has got to engage you. So it's got to take the reader with you. I want you to feel that you are the CEO of Coca-Cola. I want you to understand that you have a social nonprofit that you've put your heart in that is going to fail because you cannot convince a donor to renew to you. So there's a job of engagement. There has to be controversy. We talked about enough complexity that it's not obvious, and some intellectual richness. A question that I often get is, you know, what does make a good case situation? And the case situation has to be interesting in and of itself. So I'm going to read about this barber shop in Dorchester, and I'll be like, oh, wow, they have a set of problems. But then if I'm a top executive at Novartis, I'll be like, oh, wow, actually the set of problems that they have around retaining employees or customers is similar to mine. So both of these things have to be true, which is quite difficult to find. So this is the teaching note, which we don't need to go in. And for those of you online who are teachers, this is a summary, will be in the slides also. And please reach out to me if you would like to discuss. We'll skip over that. So we talked about that. That's a repetition. Sorry about that. So one of the challenges that we have had is that we have been presenting basically decision makers in business, and I think this is a problem of many business schools, as robots managing robots. And so in a way, it's easy and it's simple. In a way, it's completely removed from reality. So, you know, we're now dealing with a mental health crisis in the workplace. And I think as business schools, we can ask ourselves, you know, what is our contribution to the fact that we didn't think to present leaders as leaders, with fears, pathologies, different backgrounds, childhood histories. And then we're also dealing with companies, co-authors that are from different backgrounds. So a challenge about bringing humanization to cases that you don't want to do it in a way that is a cliche. Years ago, we started, you know, there was a case about a female. And I was reading it for a colleague of mine who said, do you mind to read my case? And the individual was making a decision about whether to invest or not. And the individual was musing, and she was wondering, and she was picking up her kids from daycare while looking at her term sheet. This is not how usually we describe case protagonists. He's deciding, he's calling up his co-founder, let's go. So often we find ourselves lapsing into stereotyping if we start to write about people without thinking about them. So we've worked really hard with our own team and also in training programs to have some exercises around that and to generate best practices. There's also in case, as much as there is in academic papers, you know, this very human tendency to overquote the people that you thought were cool or interesting or eloquent. So when we're done with cases, we try to highlight the quotes, highlight the people. So be a little bit more thoughtful as Caesar scribes about how you're actually writing. So we used to, so when I started at HBS in 1992, the cases where Reebok management has to decide. And more we started to put in the protagonist, the vantage point of the person. Now in 80% of these cases, we have individuals. We gather information through interviews for field cases. Library cases are written from published sources, field cases. And so what happens when you're interviewing somebody in the field or whenever you're talking to somebody is that they're telling you something, but you're interpreting it in a different way. And so trying to be quite conscious about the interpretations that you're making. So this was a draft that I got from somebody. And, you know, the story was, you know, Karen grew up in a rough neighborhood. Her mother, single parent, had to keep down. Yet I remembered my childhood as a happy one. So I actually asked the case writer to give me the transcript. I said, did the protagonist say yet, or is that your yet? And sure enough, there was no yet in the transcript. So as writers and study, you know, when we study business or employees are talking to us, very often we create our own yets about this is really, you know, it must be so. If you're telling me this story about your childhood, it must be so. Instead of asking, did you feel supported by your caregiver? Do you have secure attachment? Whatever question you might want to ask. So whenever we write, we really think about our yet. When I manage my people, I really think about my yets also. This is an example from the New York Times where you see the editor sort of doing the same thing. An African-American teenager is being described as dabbling in drugs and alcohol. And he's basically like, really? Is there a teenager who doesn't do that? So again, the choices that we make about how we write about people shapes how people think about people. So you might have noticed the first image that I used was a Midjourney image. These are two Midjourney interpretations of a protagonist, just a further visual illustration of even if I am presenting a protagonist, I will have my own bias and interpretations. So any questions or anything on Zoom? No. Very quiet, quiet audience. Oh, great. Okay. Well, my heart goes out to you and all my love. So so then the question is, in many of our minds, is, you know, ChatGPT, Gen AI is kind of breaking into the scene. So that is a topic that I thought would be interesting to talk about. If there are other topics that you would like to talk about, we can do that also. But so how many of you are using ChatGPT in your work? Okay. Do you mind to share how you're using it?
My work?
Yes, or in your personal life, or to. Oh, and Natalia, then
Okay.
Raise her hand, so we mustn't forget her.
Well, ChatGPT in the beginning was like a friend which I never had before. So I spent a lot of time talking about various topics for the business, maybe just rephrasing emails and stuff like that, being more professional.
Yeah.
For the research, it was a bit confusing because it was imagining some articles that didn't exist. So it strayed me from the right path, but it could give me in times a very good idea of what some theory is saying and summarizing things.
Yeah, I like the notion of a friend or a colleague or somebody that you can talk to, maybe be honest about what you know, what you don't know. Right, yeah, very nice. Anyone else? Has anybody used it actively to write? No, and online, I think that Natalia had raised a hand if I saw it correctly. I don't want to leave anybody behind, but. So the hallucinations are getting better. You know, it's learning really, really fast. And if you're ever worried, you can also cross-reference with Bing or something else. Sometimes. So, you know, again, so you always have to verify. And even in papers produced by humans, old school, there are always mistakes. So the machine is only as good as our mistakes have been. So would a good case contain hand? Oh, excellent, excellent question. So I think the answer would be no, and it would be no for two reasons. First, you're describing a phenomenon in basically 10 pages that is about a merger in the pharmaceutical industry. So you would have to spend if you were to have all the information that they would need, you would have to write about all the history of the company, all the theory around mergers, all of the context of the pharmaceutical industry. So I think you have to think long and hard about what are the essential pieces of information that the students need. And then two things happen. Then the faculty might choose to take some things out. so that in class, a student would say, you know, it would be really helpful if we knew what the cost of capital were so that we could make that calculation. You know, why is it missing? Very good. So you've thought about what was missing instead of just going through the motion. The other thing that sometimes is done is that they're called red herrings. I'm not a big fan of them, but people insert information that is completely irrelevant just to lead somebody down the wrong path so that there is a surprise. But it has to be back to the topic of robustness. It has to contain enough information for the decision to be done. People tend to undervalue, I think, the power of exhibits. You know, you can say a lot in an exhibit that is well placed, have 2 or 3 things that students can triangulate. One of the criticisms of the case method is that it's too prepackaged. So as a leader in the pharma industry conducting a merger, you wouldn't have anything delivered to you in 11 pages. I mean, you might have a memo, you have all kinds of things from the banks, but one of the criticisms of the case method is actually that it consolidates too much. And so teachers have been using live cases, very recent events, you know, this is what happened, how would you respond? That is less sort of, because as a manager, you probably will not have all this information. So I don't know, I hope that this answers your question. If not, please reach out to me and we can connect separately. So, you know, the way to think about this, we had the notion of a friend. You know, students are going to use it extensively. Your employees are using it extensively. You know, they're using it to sort of cut corners, go a little bit faster. On the one hand, it's good because it accelerates things. On the other hand, you know, it's difficult to test if people really understand what they're doing. This is from ChatGPT directly. So you see how they kind of advertising. You know, don't spend your hours flipping through research papers. You know, the thing is that a lot of these research papers are actually behind paywall that Chat doesn't access, so it's a little bit of a red herring. And then, you know, it's, as you know, it is looking in the past and doesn't have a lot of very recent information. So at work, employees might be using it. We can debate whether that's true about the data being secured later in the Q&A if you guys would like. So a lot of people say, you know, Chat is completely different. Artificial intelligence is completely different from natural intelligence. I mean, to me, the humans are actually the original ChatGPT, which is, you know, we take a bunch of input, then we filter it through a bunch of algorithms that are pretty biased. And sometimes we're a very good friend. Sometimes we hallucinate. Sometimes we produce something that's good. So in understanding how the tool works, I have found it helpful to understand how my mind works. Am I asking the right questions? Is it really the question to be asked here? If I'm not getting back what the system wants, you know, I'm going to think about like, you know, is there a different way for me to think about this? So this is how I use it, and my team has started to use it to ask better questions. This notion of regenerating that response, I think, is something that we don't do enough with ourselves. You know, you tend to sort of write or do something, and then you're happy with it. So sometimes I say, okay, Carin, can you regenerate that response, which is just throw the draft away and start over. So this could be a habit of mine that we could take. You know, you can boost your creativity with it. So some people are thinking, you know, it's going to free us up to do higher level tasks. I hope so. I actually think that people are going to watch a lot more cat and influencer or whatever videos on TikTok rather than having a time to think. I hope not. One way that it can help faculty members is that it is difficult to find very good research associates. It's very difficult to be a research associate as a case writer. So that's, you know, maybe a way that it enables you to maybe dabble in case writing. If you have less support, then, you know, our school is very blessed with a lot of support, like my team. We have teams all over the world. And, you know, sort of up your game also in terms of teaching, because your students are going to be using it. So you should all start at a slightly higher level of interaction. So potentially it could be very, very good. So yes, so we make a lot of mistakes. Also, here are a couple of examples that again are in the slides. So I'll just go through them very rapidly. So this is, you know, you sort of put this in, you see what it was. The more specific you can be, the more you can tell it who you are to the question that you're asking, the higher the chance of it going. Could you ask 10 questions that I could ask about the dilemma of humans or not? And so you can see what it answers. Another way is to have a teaching simulator. So one thing that I think is difficult for us as case writers and the faculty that we support is to intuit how people will react to something in the classroom based on their backgrounds. So here's an example of a prompt that might say, I'm going to be teaching to a big group of executives. Some might be from engineering, some might be from marketing, some might be from human resources, some might be from finance. They may have different reactions to my prompt. I think this is actually probably very useful as a business leader. Also, the responses, I'm not a huge fan of a lot of responses. They are quite cliched, but most of us live in worlds of cliche, or it's a cliche because it's true, as we say. So that's one way that you can think about how would actually my case situation play out to somebody who's in the world of finance. And then I can think back on my case, which is, am I providing enough in the case for the individuals to engage with this topic? So there are a lot of things that AI cannot do yet, and this is what we did with a case that we helped support on Michael Phelps, which is to really get to the emotions of what it feels like to be a high achiever like Michael Phelps. It doesn't really get to some of the drivers that people might have. So I think there's a lot of things that business schools, if they do indeed engage in the humanization of business, have a real chance. And this business school is based on the fact that leaders need mind, heart, and guts. And how you're going to show the mind, how you're going to show the heart and the gut in cases, I think is something that chat is not doing yet. So we'll see how much time it takes. One reason that I like chat is that the cases aren't in there yet. And the other reason is that he says, I suggest that you visit the Harvard Business School. So chat is working to make sure that my salary is paid. I don't think this is going to last a long time. I think actually we'll see how long that lasts. But that was my imaginary friend. I was like, oh, thank you for referring the world to the website. I'm going to go back to the topic of motivation, which I think is really just a central challenge for our times as parents. It's a central challenge for us as teachers, as writers, and anything, which is, how do you actually write in a way that captures your reader's imagination? We're moving away from a lot of automation around, this is the background of the company, this is what it is, more creativity in the title. Instead of just my thinking about a merger, I could think about in which way does this merger fit my leadership journey? By what have I been affected? And then you see teachers, and I think managers also need to do this, or the good managers do, which is actively think about the trend of disengagement and inability to disagree. So one thing that is very nice in the case method is that faculty cold call. So I would say, could you tell me why we shouldn't merge, Siba Gaigi and Sandoz? And you would say, well, here are the 5 reasons. You might think that it's a good idea or not. They'll say, give me the 5 reasons why we shouldn't. And so the faculty have to be very conscious in sort of assigning devil's advocate roles. So in my original example around the fertility clinic, maybe I would ask somebody randomly, say, could you make the argument? Could you pretend that this is a concern of yours and make that argument so that the argument enters the conversation without being attached to the person entering that argument into the space, because it's very costly for people to be entering arguments that may not be popular. And then around the thing. So I'll end with this question. We started with the General Shoe Company, which is a page long. Now a lot of cases are much longer. A lot of cases are dealing with labor as they did then. There's a very famous faculty member whom you might know at Harvard Business School, Professor Rifkin. And this is what he says, how do you go into an ambiguous situation and get to the bottom of it? And at the end of the day, this is what every case has to, the experience that we seek to provide. And so you can ask yourself, is it still true in 2023? You're getting 11 pages of text and some exhibits as a PDF. It's a story that's been told. It's a story that's in the past. It's a story that's been told by managers who have had the time to process it. So it's not immediate, it's not live, it's packaged, a question that I've been asking myself for, a long time, and this school is partly built on it. It's like, are we in this phase of a new delicate experiment, which is leadership changing to such an extent, especially post-COVID, that we have to think about different ways of teaching? Is the case method exactly the right method, or not? And which lead to, what are the role of business schools today? How can we make a difference? At lunch, we talked about the fact that maybe we need more conflict resolution skills. So in a way, the case method could be a good method for that. More empathy development, it could be a good method for that. Or it may be that the case method is costly to produce, that people don't want to engage with it because people want to sort of move on immediately or not. So those were my prepared remarks, just to share a little bit about where the school has been and things that have been on our minds. And I would like to use the rest of the time to make this as productive for you as possible. So thank you for your attention. Thank you for the gift of your time. Thank you for having me here. It's really is when Hanissa and Nadine asked if I would do it. I did little somersaults on Zoom, which are hard to see, but it really is a pleasure and an honor to talk about what I love doing most, and to help others who might have an interest in it. So thank you very much. Okay, so what else?
We have a question online, if you can just read it perhaps. And
yes, so thank you, Marina, for the question. So the diversity in case writing, about 25. So business has been global. We happen to be a Boston-based, an HBS-based business school, but the school has been very instrumental to setting up business schools all around the world, training teachers. So there's been a connection to global diversity for decades, and many decades. And then about 25 years ago, the school decided to set up a ring of research centers all over the world. And their responsibility is to source cases in that region. So it's not just to write a case on Huawei, but maybe a local company that wouldn't be in Fortune, that I wouldn't necessarily see if I were a faculty member. So we've pushed the global diversity a lot. And then the notion of how do you diversify the case protagonist? When you look at the list of Fortune 500 companies, they have a certain profile. If you write only about CEOs, you will wind up writing about a certain profile. So one of the ways that we've driven diversity is to think about, are there decision makers that are slightly lower in the organization that may be exhibiting more diversity that we could write on? So that was the other one that was done. And then there were some very conscious efforts on the part of many, many deans ever since I've been there to think about, how do we get more female case protagonists? Where are they? How can we convince them to sort of let us write about them? We live in a very multicultural society in the US. How do we make sure that we're connected with African-American alumni associations, with the Latino alumni associations, so that they send us cases and we write about them? So there's information on our website about the provenance of case protagonists. We're also gathering data about them so that we know how well we're doing on these efforts. And the avoiding biases is it really starts with yourself as a case writer. So when I'll send the slides, you'll have a easier view of some of the recommendations that we make. But I think really thinking about what is important in this case. So when you're writing about a person, there's sort of three ways to think about it. One, it may be that the background of the individual is case agnostic. So it is, the CEO of Merck, a Black man, but it's really about sort of Merck's strategy. So his story is, it's protagonist background. Then there's somewhere it's material to the story. So it's material to how he got there, but it's not the central piece of the case. The third one is it's actually fundamental to his identity. So there is a case that I'd be happy to send you the information to, which is one of the very first Black female CEOs in Silicon Valley. And she tells her story about how she got there. And you as a case writer have to retell that story to the extent possible in her voice, because one way to avoid biases is just to have the protagonists talk about themselves, and then to check your biases. protagonists also see the cases that we write. So they have an opportunity to say, this isn't what I said, this was your interpretation, can we change that? So we get a little bit of feedback on the biases there, but excellent question.
We have two more questions, if you can read them out loud and perhaps
Yes,
answer.
of
Thank you.
course. So I think this is slightly related, which is around topics of sexual orientation, just as an example. How do you feel students comfortable with the discussion? So one challenge that we've had, and I think business schools have, is that there's a case about an LGBTQ executive, and then it becomes the case. And then the individuals in that class who might identify as LGBT, are being asked to opine, and whatever they have to speak for everybody else. And so one way that the faculty members ensure that individuals aren't being put in that position is to have a conversation with the students. How should we be talking about this? How will we not force you to participate if you don't want to, force you to be the one who will educate everybody else? How do you not put the burden of education on that individual student? And then I think, there's a lot of, much like managers, teachers are signaling, which is if you signal that you would like people to be open in the classroom, you have a higher chance than if you don't signal, and maybe reminding that, this is a difficult conversation. But we need to be having these conversations as societies. We need to be having these conversations as humans. Shying away from them doesn't really bring us forward. One way that the teaching notes that we talked about earlier are important there is that in the teaching note, you may say, when you teach this case, this topic may come up. A useful reading here may be. A good question might be, if a student says this, these are 4 or 5 ways that you might choose to respond. So one way that we help with these conversations is faculty members spend a lot of time actually thinking about how to transmit some of this in the teaching note. So HBS, we write about real companies. Very, very few cases are fake, they're general experience. Yes, we need the consent for it. And the consent is actually extremely important to the process, which is the consent is a contracting conversation, which is, I would like to write a case on your company. This means that I will need disagreement. So I'm not a journalist trying to make you look bad. I'm not an analyst trying to sell your company. I would just like to understand the pros and cons. In order for the students to understand whether it's a problem or not, I'm going to need data. So it's not just consent that I think faculty obtain from the case sites, but it's a real enrolling them in the possibility of being part of the case, and also what it will take. It takes time, it takes management time. You have to expose yourself. Sometimes you have to talk about things that you wouldn't. Most cases need to be released at the end. Some cases don't get released, so the company has the power to the very, very end. And I think it's rightly so. The con of this control is that then it might be more difficult to talk about failures, because then as a manager, I may say, well, I might have said this, that I wasn't sure, but that doesn't make me look good. So back to the pros and cons of the method, and then it's up to the faculty member in the classroom to bring that up. What are you personally doing to rethink the case study method and push it to the same level? Thank you for the question. So I think this question of the yet has been motivating me, and also this comment that I am the Caesar scribe. So I have thought of my job as very much in the shadows, but just to think about how we write, why we write, what is the societal pressures that are shaping the way that I am behaving. So I try to push introspection in myself. I try to encourage it in my team. We also have a team that is very open to feedback, so we write each other's drafts. We do try to look for each other's yets. You're talking about climate change. Is there a different point of view that maybe you could have? What sources are you using? So I think a climate of feedback and honest collaboration between us might help us. I'm not very modern, you might see from my equipment, but I am very interested in technology. So I think the possibility of Gen AI, the possibility of Midjourney, I just think that's always very cool. The possibility of teaching online. How do you change cases for that? Should we be doing cartoon cases? So maybe one way I contribute is just by being very restless about, this is a method that is powerful. I like it, but I would like it to stand up the test of time. Thank you for the question. Any question from the audience? I don't want to neglect. Usually it's the people on Zoom who are neglected. Yes, please.
How important is it, in fact, that a case is not written with a subjective bias? Because you don't, a case is not written to find the truth or to validate anything. It's to invite discussion and to provoke discussion, etc. So I would think it's not so important that there is a subjective bias in the description of the case.
That's interesting. Bless you. So the footer of the HBS cases say, this is just an illustration. This is really just, so this is a teaching tool, and this is actually part of the consent question that we had earlier, which is a faculty member is coming here to use this situation to teach. The faculty member is not coming here to tell the absolute truth. There's going to be subjectivity no matter what, because you are telling me the story. So, years ago, I was in an interview and somebody said, oh, I had the idea to create the case research and writing group. And I was like, oh, okay. But we remember things differently about how things are. So that's subjectivity we can never take out. I think the balance is where I'm after, which is, if there's subjectivity, there's got to be subjectivity on both sides. And for these cases that deal with social issues or with complex societal things, we're not writing headlines for clickbait. You're trying to write documents where people are actually going to grapple with these issues. But it's an excellent formulation. Thank you for the question and the challenge.
Karin, perhaps we can take the last question we have from one of our participants online, from Volodymyr.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
I'll read for the audience. Many, maybe all our businesses go through extreme conditions and challenges. What is your view on the educational value of such cases where decisions, I'm not even going to finish the question, absolutely fundamentally super important. Cases that actually have a decision that is so extreme that it really matters what the decision is that is taken, are some of these cases where students can actually probe themselves, which is, how am I behaving to this situation? Why am I having this reaction? What are the things that I need to keep in mind? And the complexity of the environment is wonderful. I mean, I wrote a case on actually Novartis in Turkey during the extreme devaluation. And what do you do when, headquarters like, what's happening to your numbers? And you're like, do you realize my currency just devalued 80%? Well, I don't care. I've got my numbers to make. So if you have an idea of such a topic or a situation, I'd be very, very grateful to hear it. Yes, I mean, the cases should also reflect the reality of business. And, a lot of business is about things that might not go well, that might be surprising. We're starting to write more failure cases or more entrepreneurial failure cases. Why do companies fail? What happens to founders? So these kinds of cases are also evolving. So extreme situations, complex environments. And it is the environment that all of us, all of you are in, and certainly business leaders. Everything is changing 100 miles an hour. It's exhausting. We're all tired. So cases that simulate that are wonderful. Yes, please. Thank you. Thank you for the question.
I just want to ask how much scientific this case writing is in your process. How much truthful to material, to the sources, to backing up your narrative you must have there. Huh?
So I'll take a slightly different notion of maybe my thought around the use of the word scientific, which is faculty go into the field often with a hypothesis about what is happening in that company. And then the data gathering will be, what is actually happening. And the data gathering will come through interviews, sort of primary research, but also secondary research, which is I will go interview everybody at Novartis, but then I will actually look at what are the analysts saying? What is their, what are their annual reports saying? What is happening at the other competitor? So that's part of the balance and the subjectivity. And for example, if you go in and the company says, we're doing great, you want to make sure that you have an exhibit from a secondary source that shows that actually they've been growing at half of the rate of their competitors. So maybe that's a checking and balance. But the footer, it is an illustration. The cases are teaching tool. I should rephrase that. Cases in my world, for my faculty, for my clients, are teaching tools. There are cases that are written as illustrations. So the IFC has cases about how great it was that they went into the cement company. Quantitative researchers have cases about organizations. The HBS case study at its purest is a decision-making surfacing tool. So whatever science I need to get there is what the case writer does. And the other interesting thing too is that faculty tend to teach from the board back. So faculty, when you go to meet with them, they will say, at the end of the class, this is my board. Here I'm going to have the people, here I'm going to have the deal, here I'm going to have the opportunity. So when you write the case, just think, this is the board. Here's what I think are the 5 takeaways from what we heard in the field, from our research and our data collection. And the job of the case writer is to work backwards from the end. So it's very much an outcome-driven technology. Thank you for the question. All right. Any other question?
Yeah. Sorry, I do have a question. I like the fact that you mentioned the different uses of cases as well, but in academia, cases are often also used for examination purposes. And, now with that in mind, how do you think the whole ChatGPT, GPT-4 kind of like a space will influence that, or the limitations that will it bring to the use of that as part of examination? And what can be done to limit that risk?
Yeah, so thank you for the question. So I think it's an enormous risk. I think it's a risk sort of all across. And I think at HBS, the faculty member would probably think of two ways. One is to tell students actively, don't use it. And we have in the past say, don't cheat on take-home exams. So part of also being a good leader is to have ethical practices. So we may believe that they won't do it, but just say something. Or you say, this is actually a perfect tool that will enhance the power of management. So let me educate students on how to use it best and just see it as another tool in their arsenal. And I think for the way that I feel the conversation going in business schools or even in businesses, to what extent is right. So you're seeing companies, you're seeing countries trying to ban it because it's negative. I think it's going to force faculty members to be better at asking questions that are difficult to answer, because if the answer is easy, then chat can do it. If the answer is difficult, then chat cannot do it. And maybe instead of assigning just a case, you could assign 2 smaller cases. Chat is not good at mixing sort of different backgrounds. So to think long and hard about how can you, so if I were my own business school, I would try to teach students how to use it. It's not going away. It is our reality. How to use it ethically, how to also check for biases, but also really push them to still think and to still criticize. So it's difficult. The answer is not quite depends, but I don't think we have a choice but to teach students how to use it. Yes. Yes, and
I was very pleasantly surprised 2-3 days ago. Our professor for finance, Jim Eller, told me that somebody was cheating at his exam with ChatGPT, and then because we have this program which is discovering cheating, he was putting this task on the professor did. Put that, in this, let me see, in this program or whatever, you say that. And then it was even the name throwing out, and even exactly what he was cheating, etc. And then he showed him, he said, look, I was telling you that we are here really not allowing the cheating and so on. And he has a problem now with this, this guy has a problem now to finish this studies and the exam in finance, because he was doing that. And he said to me, professor said, also these apparatus for discovering this cheating are now updated already to the ChatGPT.
But it took 15 minutes of coding to come up with, what is it called, Chat Zero, or GPT-0, that actually makes it look like it wasn't written by ChatGPT. So it inverts words that always come together. So I think the technological arms race, I think, is going to be very different. Students are smarter than most individual. Yeah, they're ingenious. They're clever. I think maybe as a faculty member, you have to say, if you use it, then say so. So now you say people saying this section was written by ChatGPT. It's a disclaimer. The problem is if you read one section written by ChatGPT, you're going to be like, well, did you really read the other? Write the other parts. So this is, I think, the teething pains of using that technology. But the faculty member, I think, bears some partial responsibility to not having been explicit to say, you're not allowed to use. I mean, can you imagine if you told somebody you can't use Google, you can't use Capital IQ? This is a resource like another, and the skilled people will run the world at figuring out how to use it, I think. Yes, please.
Perhaps just one comment. You are talking now about ChatGPT, but for example, yesterday I ran into a website, topai.tools, and there you can click on topic education, and it throws out in seconds, in a matter of seconds, 115 tools that you can use, and ChatGPT being one of them. So definitely, this is here, and we are not.
The horse is out of the barn, the cat is out of the bag, the mish is out of, I don't know what it is. It's like it's over. So we got to figure out how to go with it. And I think it's so wonderfully challenging. It's very challenging to managers also, because a lot of the work that I do around editing, around coaching, did you really mean to say that? I can be replaced. People can put what they're writing in there, regenerate, basically what does a manager say, or a faculty supervisor? Regenerate response. I didn't like your draft. Here's my input. Do it again. If they don't need me anymore, then I have to ask myself sort of what is my value add. So what I think ChatGPT is good for is it really forces us to think about what is our superpower, what are we good at? We've been going through the motions of doing a lot of stuff in our lives. Now we're going to automate some of this, and the question is, what are we going to do with the brain power that we're freeing up? And the imaginary friend, I'm going to love that. I'm going to take that. This new friend that we have, this new coach, this new challengers that we have. So that's a positive. On the negative side is that it takes me 100 hours at least to write a case, and you can produce a published sources case in about 70 minutes. So can I stand here and tell you that I'm excited about ChatGPT? I am excited. Half of my brain, maybe 49%, 51% of my brain is really scared, because soon you won't need people like me. So, but humanity has been through there before. So anyway, so thank you very much for the questions, and please stay in touch if there's anything. Thank you for everybody meeting us on Zoom, and it's really a thrill to talk.